Hey everybody, today's lesson is on empirical and molecular formulas. The reason why we're talking about these in this unit is because in order to work with empirical and molecular formulas, we're going to need to do some mole conversions. And the easiest way I think to talk about these is with an example. So you guys are familiar with carbohydrates. You know carbohydrates are, these carbon, hydrogen, oxygen molecules that we often find in our bodies, and we also eat for energy and for fuel. But you're probably familiar with carbs as like, oh, well, sugar is a carb, and flour is a carb, and pasta is a carb. But there are actually lots of different types of carbohydrates. Here are a couple of different carbohydrates. One carbohydrate is ribose. It's found in RNA. And its formula is C5H10O5. A different type of carbohydrate is glucose, also known as the sugar that is found in your blood sugar. Glucose is C6H12O6. Another form of carbohydrate is lactose. This is what's found in milk and cheese. Some people are allergic to lactose. C12H24O12. And what you might have noticed, besides the fact that these all are carbon, hydrogen, oxygen compounds, is that they all have the same proportion or the same ratio of 1 carbon to 2 hydrogens to 1 oxygen. That's that smallest whole number ratio that they each have in common. This reduced smallest whole number ratio is called the empirical formula of the compounds. And in fact, that is what makes a carbohydrate a carbohydrate. If the compound has a CH2O base formula, we classify that as a carb. These actual formulas of the compound that make them, in fact, different from one another are the true formulas of the compound, or the molecular formulas. So let's go ahead and define those. An empirical formula is the smallest whole number ratio of elements in a compound. It's the simplest formula. I had trouble saying that word there for a second. Or the reduced formula. But like I said, there can be many compounds that have the same empirical formula that in fact are very different from one another. And so in order to understand what the substance actually is, we need the molecular formula. The molecular formula is the true or actual formula of the compound. And what we've noticed here is that the molecular formula is a multiple of the empirical formula. So we could write that as an equation. The molecular formula is equal to some whole number times the empirical formula. If we go back up to our examples up here and we look up top, the empirical formula times 5 gives us ribose, times 6 gives us glucose, and times 12 gives us lactose. So you can see these whole number multiples tell us what actual carbohydrate we are working with. Now, this is not just true for carbohydrates. There are lots of different types of compounds that share empirical formulas but have different molecular formulas. Now, why do we care? We care about the difference between these two things because when we are trying to identify unknown substances, either that we find in nature or new substances that are discovered or synthesized in the lab, the first thing that we determine about that substance is its empirical formula. And then the next thing, we have to do a little bit more work in order to figure out its molecular formula. So knowing the empirical formula is not enough because that obviously doesn't tell us with specificity which substance it is. So let's pretend that we are explorers or astronauts and we bring back from our mission a sample of an unknown compound. Now, we can take that compound and we can run it through a laboratory procedure to determine its percent composition. And in this particular example, we determined that the compound was 40% carbon, 6.71% hydrogen, and 53.3% oxygen. What we want to do is work backwards from these percentages to figure out the formula of the compound. It's a really simple, easy, and I think kind of fun calculation to do. All right, so the first step in this calculation is to turn these percentages into mass values. So the easiest way to do that is just to assume that we have a 100-gram sample. Now, you don't necessarily have a 100-gram sample, but it doesn't matter because a percentage is a proportion. And so whether you had a 100-gram sample or a 50-gram sample, the percentages are going to be the same. So I like to assume a 100-gram sample because if I had a 100-gram sample, that would mean that I had 40 grams of carbon and 6.71 grams of hydrogen and 53.3 grams of oxygen. Right? So like the easiest thing is to just assume a 100-gram sample and then you can just turn your percents right into mass values. The next thing that we need to do is we need to turn these grams into moles, which is why we're talking about this in the mole unit. And we know to convert grams to moles, we need to use the molar mass. So I'm going to multiply by my molar mass conversion factor. 1 mole of carbon is 12 grams of carbon. And 1 mole of hydrogen is 1 gram. And 1 mole of oxygen is 16 grams, right? Because we want our grams to cancel. That's why we're dividing, right? So to go from here to here, I essentially divide by molar mass. So 40 divided by 12 is 3.33. Keep a couple sig figs here. 6.71 divided by 1 is, of course, 6.71. And 53.3 divided by 16 is also 3.33. Now these are moles. But we don't write the formulas for our compounds, you guys. Like I don't write carbon 3.33, hydrogen 6.71, oxygen 3.33. Like that's not how we write the formulas for compounds. We write them as whole number ratios. So in order to turn these into whole number ratios, what we're going to do is we're going to divide by the smallest of those 3 values. So we're going to divide by 3.33, divide by 3.33, divide by 3.33. Now I have a nice whole number ratio, 1 to 2 to 1. Okay, so to go from moles to a mole ratio, to go from here to here, you're going to divide by the smallest mole value. And this now tells me that I have a CH2O compound. That's my empirical formula. Oh, look, this substance is a carbohydrate. Again, they're not all going to be carbohydrate examples. I'm just sticking with today's theme. Okay, but this right here does not tell us which carbohydrate we have. Okay, so we've done the first leg of the problem. We've figured out the empirical formula. Now we need to figure out the molecular formula. So here's how we're going to do that. The first thing you need to recognize is that the molecular formula is some whole number times the empirical formula. Remember, like ribose was times 5 and lactose was times 12. So how do we figure out that whole number is the question. That whole number is figured out by dividing the mass of the molecular formula by the mass of the empirical formula. Now, the mass of the molecular formula is like the true molar mass of the compound, okay? And in your problems, this will be given. And you might be wondering, Ms. Rivera, if we don't know the molecular formula, how do we know the molar mass? Great question. The way that we figure that out is with a different lab procedure. Okay, so there's another type of lab procedure that we'll talk about and actually do in AP Chem that allows us to figure out the molar mass of an unknown compound. So in our case, it's going to be given because it was determined in the lab. Okay, and you can see for this problem, the molar mass is given as 120 grams per mole. The mass of the empirical formula, we know, we can calculate because we already figured out the empirical formula. So we're just going to calculate that value. Okay, so let's get that whole number. The molar mass of the true formula, 120 grams per mole. They figured it out in the lab. We figured out the empirical formula was CH2O, right? CH2O. We figured that out earlier. So that's 12 plus 2 times 1 plus 16. The mass of the empirical formula is 30 grams per mole. So my multiple is 4, right? Grams per mole cancel. I basically need to take this empirical formula and multiply it by 4. So my molecular formula is going to be equal to 4 times CH2O. The molecular formula is C4H8O4. And there you have it. That's my unknown compound. That's a carbohydrate called threose. Probably haven't heard of that one before. Okay, so there you have it, you guys. Determining the identity of an unknown compound by working through first to find its empirical formula and then moving on to finding its true molecular formula. Good job.